John Constantine crouched over a circle etched in soot and chalk, fingertips pressed to the ground as he murmured words older than the city itself. The candlelight trembled, flickering across his face, glinting in the cigarette clamped between his teeth. He drew a line in his own blood, feeling the sting as it soaked into the chalk. The air tasted of dust and iron, his lungs tightening with each breath. A sudden vibration ran through the circle. Constantine's eyes narrowed. A sound, a tearing, a hum, rose from nowhere and everywhere at once. He snapped his head back toward the darkened doorway. Something was wrong. The sigils flared white, bright, blinding. The hum turned into a piercing whistle that clawed at his ears. He shielded his eyes with one arm as heat washed over him. Concrete and brick blurred beneath the intensity. Sirens wailed somewhere beyond the walls. He felt himself lifted, weightless, suspended as if the floor had disappeared. A snap of cold air jolted across his face, but it burned too. His fingers twitched, gripping at the air as the world unspooled. Then, nothing. Silence. The ground hit him hard. Breath knocked out of his lungs. Dust filled his nose and throat. He coughed violently, chest heaving. Constantine rolled onto his side, spitting ash and grit, hand gripping the trench coat that had saved him more than once. A distant crackle, then a low hiss. The hair on his neck prickled. He pushed himself up, knees scraping against jagged concrete. A figure moved, or something moved like a figure, its skin pale, stretched, grotesque. A ghoul. Its eyes glowed faint green, staring at him with something between hunger and curiosity. Gunfire snapped from the street beyond. The ghoul recoiled, and Constantine stumbled backward, coughing through the acrid dust. His hand twitched toward his coat pocket, reaching instinctively for the sigil he hadn't had time to readjust. Another crack. The ghoul hissed and lunged. Constantine flicked a wrist. Magic, but wrong, half-formed, a twist of luck more than skill. The creature froze mid-lunge, twitching, heat radiating from its body before crumpling to the ground. John Constantine wiped his hand across his mouth, tasting copper. He blinked through dust and ash, looking toward the distant shadows of buildings, hearing the faint, irregular hum of something alive and wrong. A burst of wind rattled debris across the street. Concrete cracked underfoot. Sirens faded into the distance. Silence lingered just long enough for him to realize the obvious. He drew a shaky breath, brushing ash from his coat. Cigarette dangling, smoke curling lazily upward. John Constantine. This ain't hell. But it nicked all the furniture. The street smelled of scorched metal and dust, thick in Constantine's nostrils as he picked his way over fragments of concrete and twisted rebar. A figure appeared from the shadows, lean, eyes bright under a hood, fingers twitching around the grip of a jagged pipe. Constantine's boots crunched against the rubble, echoing in the hollow city. "Name's Scrapjack," the man said, voice low, cautious. He held a hand out, rough and cracked from too many fires and too little water. "You look like trouble, or trouble looks like you." Constantine smirked, cigarette dangling. He flicked ash onto the cracked pavement. "Could be either," he muttered, eyes scanning the alleys. Movement flitted in the corners, shadows elongating, folding over themselves. Scrapjack nodded once and gestured for him to follow. Constantine walked beside him, coat brushing against rubble, fingers grazing rusted metal. The city was alive with small sounds. The whine of wind through fractured concrete, distant groans, the soft, wet shuffle of something scuttling behind a pile of debris. Without warning, a sharp, metallic snap echoed from above. Constantine ducked instinctively, heart hammering. Shadows dropped from the rooftops, 3 figures, clad in jagged armor and spikes, guns raised, teeth bared. Raiders. Scrapjack cursed, spinning to draw his pipe. Constantine's hand twitched toward his pocket, brushing the cold metal of his talisman. "Right," he muttered. "Let's do this the hard way." The first raider charged, a chain clanging over his shoulder. Constantine spoke a single word, guttural, ancient. A flare of green light burst from his palm. But it sputtered, weak, striking the raider in patches. The man screamed, heat rolling across his chest as his flesh bubbled unevenly, the magic misfiring. He collapsed, convulsing, leaving behind a faint wisp of smoke. The other 2 froze, eyes wide. One raised his gun, finger trembling. The barrel clicked empty. Constantine exhaled slowly, smoke curling in lazy spirals. He shifted his weight, coat brushing against dust, knuckles whitening as he clenched the pipe at his side. Scrapjack ducked behind a chunk of crumbled wall, eyes darting between Constantine and the remaining raiders. "What the hell are you?" he hissed. Constantine tilted his head, cigarette between teeth, eyes flicking over the metal spikes and cracked helmets. Wizard, professional, bit out of practice, but still lethal. He muttered under his breath another syllable, and the second raider's armor heated unnaturally, metal bending with a hiss. He screamed, staggered back, leaving a trail of molten streaks on the ground. Scrapjack's mouth fell open. He blinked. Christ! The third raider spun, gun swinging. Constantine ducked instinctively, feeling the breeze of the bullets slice past. He snapped his fingers, muttered an incantation, and the pavement beneath the raider cracked, raising sharp ridges that snagged his boots. The man stumbled, flailing, before collapsing face first into a pile of rubble. Constantine stepped over the fallen cigarette ash flicking onto the twisted concrete. Heat rose from the melting metal, scent sharp in his nostrils, tangy with ozone. He adjusted his coat, brushing dust from the lapel, and glanced at Scrapjack, who was still pressed against the wall, wide-eyed. "You don't see magic much around here, do you?" Constantine said, voice dry, low. "It's not polite, but it gets the job done." Scrapjack swallowed, nodding. "You're insane," he breathed, though not entirely incredulous. There was awe in his eyes, tempered by fear. Constantine caught it. A sudden whoop-whoop cut through the air. Both of them looked up. A vertibird passed overhead, rotors chopping the pale light into rhythmic shadows. Its hull bore the insignia of the Brotherhood. Dust swirled in its wake. Somewhere inside, a voice barked commands. Constantine tilted his head, the cigarette balanced between fingers, the tip glowing faintly. He flicked ash at the ground, grinding it into the cracked concrete. The vertibird vanished over the skyline. "Word's gonna get around," Scrapjack muttered. "They're calling you the wizard in the ruins." Constantine shrugged, taking a long drag. The smoke filled his lungs, acrid and bitter. His eyes swept the street. Rubble, shadows, distant echoes of movement. Somewhere a ghoul shuffled, unseen, a soft hiss punctuating the silence. The city was alive, and every vibration on the concrete, every clatter of debris, every faint metallic ping told him it had noticed him. He exhaled slowly, smoke drifting in the wind. Fingers flexed against the sigil in his pocket, brushing the ridges. He felt the residual heat from the melted raider's armor, still lingering on the ground in faint waves. Blood and metal and magic mixed into a thick tang that clung to his skin. "Right," he said finally, voice low, carrying a sardonic edge. "Let's keep moving before more of your friends show up." Scrapjack nodded, scrabbling to his feet. They moved down the street, boots crunching against concrete and scattered metal. Constantine's eyes were sharp, catching the subtle shifts of dust and shadow. Every distant echo, every small movement in the ruins told him where danger waited. A sudden echo of gunfire rang from the alley behind them. He didn't flinch. Instead, he muttered under his breath, and the faint green glow of magic traced along his fingertips, ready. His coat brushed against rubble again, dust clinging to his sleeves. The street stretched ahead, broken and jagged. He could feel the wasteland around him, each vibration through the cracked concrete, each faint hum in the distance, a city alive, hostile, and waiting. He exhaled, dragging smoke through his teeth, and flicked the end of his cigarette onto the rubble. Sparks flared. "Let's see who else wants to meet the wizard," he muttered, a grin tugging at his lips. And somewhere, far above, the vertibird passed again, its rotors beating a warning across the ruins. Word would spread. John Constantine adjusted his coat, shoulders stiffening. Dust and heat clung to him, tangling in his hair. He moved forward. The city, restless and dangerous, followed. The wind carried dust like a fine veil, curling around Constantine's coat as he picked his way over broken pavement. His boots crunched against shattered concrete, echoing faintly in the hollow street. He adjusted his trench coat, tugging it tighter across his chest, feeling grit rub along the sleeves, prickling his forearms. A faint hum reached him, low and rhythmic, rising above the wind's irregular whisper. He tilted his head, nostrils flaring at the metallic tang that carried with it the distant scent of ozone and burned circuitry. It wasn't movement he heard at first. It was voice, tinny, vibrating through a crackling transmitter somewhere nearby. "Ladies and gentlemen of the Wasteland," the voice boomed, distorted, rolling across the rubble-strewn streets. "Have you heard of the wizard in the ruins?" Constantine froze mid-step, cigarette trembling between his fingers. The sound carried a strange, celebratory rhythm, punctuated by static. He squinted through dust-blurred sunlight, sensing movement beyond the light, in the alleys, behind twisted metal frames. The voice continued, a melodic urgency laced with humor, the kind that made him want to laugh despite himself. "Word is, he's dangerous. He's bloody brilliant. He makes raiders melt and ghosts scream." Constantine exhaled slowly, smoke curling around his fingers. The taste of ash and acrid metal coated his tongue. A faint heat pricked at his scalp. He tugged at his collar to scratch an itch there, feeling the grit rub into his skin. The voice on the transmitter paused, replaced by music, old pre-war static, a tune half forgotten. He felt it in his chest, a pulse resonating alongside the soft hum in the ruins, as if the city itself was aware of the broadcast. He listened, letting the rhythm guide his eyes across the street. Shadows flickered between skeletal structures, a movement here, a shimmer there. Then he saw it, faint forms, translucent, glimmering in patches of sunlight, filtering through broken walls. Pre-war civilians, or what remained of them, drifting across streets that had once been bustling. Their mouths moved in silent desperation, faces blurred and twisted, some reaching as if they expected him to answer. Constantine's jaw tightened. He drew in a breath, tasting dust, ash, and something faintly sweet. Rot or radiation. He couldn't place it. His fingertips brushed the sigil in his coat pocket, feeling the cold ridges, a small anchor in this unsettled city. A soft breeze shifted, carrying a faint scent of fire and ozone. Somewhere distant, metal creaked, a skeletal echo of machinery struggling to maintain balance in the ruins. He shifted his weight, boots scraping against rubble, each step deliberate. The ghosts flickered again, clustering near a shattered building, their forms wavering with the light. Constantine squinted, focusing, smoke curling from the cigarette between his fingers. He saw one reach for him, its expression a blend of hope and fear. He raised a hand in acknowledgement, feeling the weight of their attention press against him, tangible and almost suffocating. "First supernatural sign," he muttered under his breath, voice low. Dust swirled around him, dancing in thin columns as the wind caught it. His coat brushed against the edges of a broken sign, scratching faintly, gritty against his forearm. He swallowed, tasting copper and ash, lungs tightening with each shallow breath. The radio voice returned, crackling over the airwaves. "They say he can hear the dead, talk to things that shouldn't exist, and survive places the living cannot. Constantine. That's the name." He exhaled, letting the smoke drift across his vision, a thin veil that blurred the shifting light and the pale shapes around him. His fingers flexed against the sigil, heart beating faster as he felt the energy in the ruins pulse faintly, responding to his presence. The wind picked up, scattering dust into his eyes. He blinked rapidly, tasting grit on his tongue. Somewhere behind him, a soft shuffle. Not human, not fully. A ghost? A ghoul? The boundary was already thinning, the city bending in ways he hadn't yet measured. A flicker of movement to his right drew his gaze. Shadows deepened, twisting unnaturally in patches of sunlight. He felt a pull in his chest, the weight of something immense watching from the distance. Beneath it all, a presence, smoldering like coals beneath ash, hot, alive, and patient. Constantine exhaled again, smoke curling upward, his fingers flexed, feeling the ridges of the talisman grounding him. The ghosts continued to drift closer, faces blurred, some pointing, some reaching. A whisper brushed at his ears, faint, melodic, distorted. "He knows, he watches, he waits." His eyes narrowed. The pulse in his chest tightened. He shifted his stance, boots pressing against the rubble, coat brushing gritty edges. His hand moved toward the cigarette, lighting it, drawing in the acrid smoke, feeling it fill his lungs. It was a small comfort in a city that had already taken everything from the living. The vertibird passed overhead, a shadow flitting across the ruins, rotors chopping the air in steady, rhythmic pulses. Constantine's eyes followed it briefly, then returned to the ghosts. Their attention was on him alone, the voice from the radio carrying on, blending with the distant echo of mechanical hums and shifting dust. He muttered under his breath, voice dry, sarcastic, steady. "John Constantine." Great. Words out. And the ghosts are already gossiping. The static of the radio crackled, a laugh almost human, almost mocking, mingling with the whine of wind and distant metal groans. Constantine shifted his weight, coat brushing against concrete, fingers brushing the talisman again. He could feel it. The city had noticed him, in pieces and in whispers, watching, waiting. A faint green glow flickered across the edge of a building, ghostly, deliberate. The hum in the air deepened. Constantine's pulse picked up slightly, a tick in his ears, muscles tightening in anticipation. He took a slow drag from his cigarette, smoke filling his lungs, and let it curl lazily across his vision, a thin veil against the shifting light. Then, as the wind caught dust and ash in spiraling columns, he exhaled, voice low and sardonic. "John Constantine. Right. Time to meet the angels of this city, or whatever the hell they are." The radio continued to broadcast his legend, crackling through the ruins, the voice painting him in awe and fear. The ghosts drifted closer, some reaching, some gesturing, all watching. Constantine adjusted his coat, boots crunching softly against concrete, fingers brushing the rough talisman again. He stepped forward, cigarette smoke trailing in thin clouds, ready for whatever had decided to notice him first. John Constantine's boots crunched over ash and splintered wood, every step rattling through the hollow street. The heat hit him first, dry and bitter, curling along his skin, making sweat bead at his temples under the collar of his trench coat. The faint scent of ozone and burnt flesh lingered in the air, carried in soft gusts through the narrow alleys. He paused, cigarette dangling from his lips, smoke curling around his face. Something moved ahead, a flicker of orange against the gray, light dancing across broken metal and warped planks. The glow pulsed, almost like breathing, warm and erratic. His hand twitched toward the sigil in his coat pocket, cold against his fingers, grounding him. Scraps of debris shifted. Whispers carried in the wind, low, indistinct. Constantine adjusted his stance, shoulders coiled, eyes scanning the ruins. Then he saw them, figures hunched around a fire, bodies thin and mottled, skin stretched taut in places, glowing faintly with something unnatural. Ghouls, but not mindless, ritualistic, devotional. Children of the burn, he muttered under his breath, eyes narrowing. The firelight danced across their faces, hollow and hungry, reflecting off the faintly luminescent runes etched into their skin. They were chanting, low and rhythmic, words warped from memory and desperation. The air vibrated with the cadence, pressing against his chest, resonating in his ears. The smell of burning metal, sweat, and something faintly sweet, chemicals, rot, maybe blood, filled his nostrils. His lungs ached with every inhale. Constantine stepped closer, boots scraping against gravel, dust rising in small clouds around his ankles. Fingers flexed, brushing the edges of his coat, talisman pressing cold into his palm. One ghoul raised its head, eyes glowing brighter, and let out a shrill cry that echoed between the ruined walls. The fire leapt, sparks flaring, and a faint heat prickled his skin. Constantine's hand twitched, a word forming on his lips, ancient and sharp. He flicked his wrist, magic flared but unpredictable. The fire roared higher, smoke spiraling into the dim sky, tendrils curling toward the chanting figures. Chaos broke instantly. Some of the ghouls staggered, screaming, clutching at their glowing runes. Others froze, heads tilting unnaturally, eyes wide. Constantine moved forward, boots crunching hard against splintered wood, adjusting his coat as the heat prickled his back. His pulse thumped in rhythm with the panicked chanting, heartbeat echoing in his ears. He ducked low, rolling past a fallen beam, feeling the rough wood scrape across his shoulder. Sparks flew where his magic brushed the edges of the fire, hissing and popping, smoke curling over his head. One ghoul lunged, teeth bared. Constantine twisted, grabbing the nearest plank, swinging with precision born of habit. The ghoul collapsed, a hiss leaving its throat, smoke curling from the ragged wounds. The child, small, trembling, one hand clutching a scorched teddy, the other pressed to a rune-marked chest, stood frozen near the edge of the firelight. Constantine's eyes locked on it. Its face was pale, cheeks streaked with ash and tears, eyes wide in terror. He felt a pang in his chest, tightening like the world had shoved a fist into his ribs. "Stay back," he muttered, voice low, calm despite the chaos, smoke curling around his lips. He raised a hand, flicking it slightly. Sparks flared at the edges of the fire again, creating a barrier, a thin line between the child and the ritual. The child's lips quivered, it seemed to understand, stepping back just enough to avoid the flames. Around him, the other ghouls screamed, some melting into the firelight, others retreating, their glowing runes flaring and dimming in confusion. Constantine moved with them, every muscle tense, coat brushing against splintered debris, cigarette balanced in his fingers, smoke drifting upward, tangling with the acrid air. Then came the shots, distant, ragged, echoing through the hollow streets. Sparks jumped across metal and stone, ricocheting in small bursts of sound. Constantine flinched, ducking behind a collapsed wall, heart hammering, lungs tight. He peered over the edge. A raider, just one, firing wildly, disrupted the ritual, scattering debris and smoke. The child shrank lower, whimpering. Constantine exhaled sharply, eyes narrowing, focusing. His fingers brushed the cold metal of his talisman. Another word left his lips, sharp and deliberate. The fire roared again, shaping a barrier around the child, protecting it from both the raider and the chanting ghouls. He ducked further, boots pressing against the rubble, feeling each jagged edge beneath his soles. The chanting faltered, broken by the noise and chaos. Some ghouls staggered backward, confused, some screaming in pain as magic misfired across the scorched street. Sparks and smoke filled the air. Constantine moved, short, precise steps, every motion deliberate, coat brushing rough surfaces, gloves smudged with ash and grit. He reached the child, crouching low, hand extended. Fingers brushed the small shoulder, feeling the slight tremble, the warmth beneath the thin, scorched clothing. "Come on," he murmured, voice low and steady. "We're getting out of here." The child's hand slipped into his, tiny and fragile, fingers clutching his coat for balance. Constantine rose slightly, adjusting his grip, cigarette dangling, eyes scanning the chaotic street. Sparks danced across the remaining fire, shadows flitting unnaturally along the ruined walls. He felt it then, a presence, faint but insistent, like heat beneath ash. Something waiting, watching, just beyond the edges of the smoke and firelight. Constantine swallowed, pulse thudding, and started moving. The ghouls hesitated, some retreating, some still chanting broken verses to the air. Constantine guided the child, boots crunching against ash and debris, coat brushing his legs, smoke curling around his head like a faint halo. He didn't look back. The sounds of the city, the distant whine of metal, the low hum of hidden engines, the whisper of displaced air, pressed in around him, guiding him forward. At the far edge of the street, rubble cleared just enough for them to step into relative safety. Constantine's hand tightened over the child's small fingers. He exhaled, smoke curling upward, heat radiating off the scorched ground. The ritual, the ghouls, the chaos, they were behind him, muted now by distance and magic. He stopped, brushing ash from his coat, cigarette balanced between his lips. The child looked up at him, eyes wide, teetering between fear and hope. Constantine gave a small, dry nod, voice low. "John Constantine. Sorry about the rest, couldn't save 'em all." The city waited, indifferent, but the child was safe. For now. John Constantine's boots sank slightly into the powdery ground as he approached the settlement at the edge of a collapsed highway. The air tasted thick with dust and something metallic, sharp, tangling with a faint acrid scent of burned flesh and chemicals. Every breath scraped the back of his throat, lungs tightening. Ahead, figures moved, massive, hulking forms, skin mottled green and gray, faces twisted in focus, chanting in a low guttural rhythm. Their voices carried across the ruins, vibrating the cracked concrete beneath his boots. Runes glowed faintly across their chests and arms, etched into their flesh with lines that shimmered like hot metal. Constantine felt it in his gut, the pulse of their magic, raw, unpolished, radiating power in waves. He ducked low behind a half-collapsed wall, fingers brushing against the jagged edge, grit pressing into his gloves. Cigarette dangling, he observed, eyes narrowing. The mutants moved in a circle, swaying, chanting verses he could recognize but distorted, twisted through mouths that were too large, too coarse, too wrong. The air around them shimmered faintly, warping light in waves. "Bloody hell," he muttered under his breath, tongue tasting grit and copper. He shifted his weight, boots scraping against concrete, toes pressing against shards of metal. The hum in the ruins deepened, vibrating through his teeth and bones. He flexed his fingers against the talisman in his coat pocket, grounding himself. One mutant stepped forward, shoulders heavy with muscle and armor scraps, face etched in faint luminescent runes. Its eyes were intelligent, burning with a strange clarity. Constantine's pulse quickened, muscles tensing. "Angel in the reactor," the mutant growled, voice like gravel rolling over metal. Every word vibrated through the street, resonating along rubble and twisted rebar. The others stopped, swaying in perfect unnatural synchrony, eyes fixed on the first. Constantine exhaled slowly, smoke curling from his cigarette. Heat prickled along his neck and wrists, a reaction to the magic in the air. He shifted slightly, coat brushing against a jagged beam, gritty fibers catching on his gloves. He had no illusions. This wasn't a friendly welcome. The mutant prophet raised one massive hand, etched runes flaring brighter, light dancing along cracks in the concrete. A pulse of energy hummed through the street, resonating in his chest, making teeth rattle and stomach churn. Constantine's hand twitched instinctively toward the talisman, then hesitated. Whatever spell he tried would need precision. He wasn't dealing with humans. Another chant rose louder, and the light intensified, shimmer brushing the edges of the street. Constantine flexed his fingers, felt the pulse of residual radiation mix with the magic, prickling skin, making hair stand on end. He adjusted his stance, boots pressing firmly against rubble, eyes scanning the mutants for weakness. The prophet spoke again, words reverberating off the broken walls, every syllable pulling at the edges of Constantine's senses. The others repeated, swaying in time, each movement deliberate, almost ritualistic. The energy coiled, tightening like a spring in his chest, and for a moment he felt the wasteland itself hold its breath. He moved, slow, deliberate, careful not to disturb the flow too soon. Fingers brushed the talisman, cold metal against warm skin, grounding him. Cigarette smoke curled, carrying the sharp tang of ash and acrid heat into his senses. His eyes flicked across the runes on the mutant's arms, absorbing patterns, calculating. The pulse of their chant grew, resonating in the air, vibrating through the concrete, rattling loose fragments under his boots. Constantine exhaled sharply, tongue pressing against teeth, lungs straining as he felt the raw energy pressing in, heavy and alive. He could sense it, hell and radiation entwined here, merging in ways that had no precedent. A thought hit him sharply. Hell had fused with the fallout. Souls trapped, demons bred in this energy, and these giants were its first apostles. The heat prickled along his forearms, and the metallic tang in the air deepened. He swallowed, pulse hammering, coat brushing against shards of concrete as he shifted for a better angle. The prophet's eyes flicked toward him, scanning, measuring. The chant faltered for a fraction of a heartbeat, and Constantine moved with it, small steps, boots crunching softly against rubble. Smoke curled around him, fingers tightening against the talisman. He muttered under his breath, words sharp, flicking sparks along the edge of the circle. A ripple of light spread through the mutants, runes flaring bright. One staggered, muscles convulsing as the energy responded to Constantine's magic, but wrong, misaligned. He had touched the raw pulse, and it had flinched, like a living thing reacting to the smallest prod. The prophet growled, stepping forward, the ground vibrating with each massive stride. Constantine felt the pulse in his chest tighten, lungs aching, fingers flexing against the cold ridges of his talisman. The air vibrated, the chant swelling, light shimmering across concrete and rubble in a dizzying wave. He exhaled, smoke trailing past his eyes, and muttered dryly, "John Constantine. Lovely. Radiation and hell. What could possibly go wrong?" The prophet raised both arms, the runes burning brighter, energy coiling, twisting in the air like serpents of light. Constantine shifted again, coat brushing against jagged concrete, cigarette dangling, heartbeat hammering. The world seemed to hum with expectation, the pulse pressing against him, calling for release, for action. He stepped into the circle, deliberate, boots crunching, every movement measured, hands brushing the air, fingers twitching. The chant faltered, energy recoiling. Constantine tilted his head, eyes narrowing, calculating his next move. He exhaled slowly, smoke curling upward, and muttered, "John Constantine. Right. Let's see if Hell's leftovers can do the polite thing and stand still for a chat." The mutants paused, swaying, runes glowing, watching him. The air crackled with tension, hot and metallic, every heartbeat, every inhale, every breath tasting dust and heat. Constantine flexed fingers around his talisman, pulse pounding, ready for whatever came next. John Constantine ducked under the rusted frame of a collapsed overpass, the air thick with ozone and the metallic tang of scorched concrete. Dust clung to his coat, rough against his forearms as he brushed past jagged shards of metal. Each step brought a soft crunch beneath his boots, the sound echoing faintly in the hollowed street. Ahead, a dim light flickered from a half-destroyed lab building. Inside, the faint hum of generators pulsed through the walls, mixing with the acrid scent of chemicals. Constantine paused at the doorway, cigarette dangling from his lips, smoke curling lazily upward. His fingers brushed the sigil in his coat pocket, grounding him against the tension that prickled his skin. A figure emerged from the shadows. Dr. Miriam Heller, former Enclave scientist, eyes sharp beneath streaked hair, gloves smudged with soot and chemical residue. Her presence carried authority, but there was something else, something in the way the air around her seemed heavier, charged. Constantine's gaze swept her stance, noting every twitch of her fingers, every subtle shift as she adjusted a valve on a generator. "Constantine," she said, voice low, clipped. "I've been expecting someone like you." The words cut through the ambient hum. He squinted through the dust, feeling the pulse of residual radiation in the air, vibrating faintly against his chest. "You've been busy," he muttered, voice dry. The cigarette smoke curled around his face, acrid, bitter. His boots shifted on the concrete, toes pressing against small fragments of broken glass, shards catching the faint light. "Doctor!" Heller gestured him in, leading him to a table covered with scattered devices, monitors flickering erratically. The smell of ozone, metal, and chemicals thickened, tangling with the underlying acrid rot of the wasteland. Constantine ran his fingers along the edge of the table, feeling rough metal and warped wood beneath his touch. "This place," he started, voice low, eyes scanning the flickering monitors. Radiation everywhere, souls trapped, demons breeding. He trailed off, catching the faint shimmer of energy pulsing through the room. Dr. Heller's eyes darkened. "You noticed? Good. Nuclear fallout didn't just kill, it fused. The spiritual field is alive here. Souls don't leave, they linger, mutate. Demons reproduce in the gaps between energy and matter. Her fingers traced the faint glow on a monitor, the lights dancing like tiny specters. Constantine's pulse quickened. He leaned closer, boots pressing against the warped floor, coat brushing against the rough edges of tables and cables. Fingers flexed around the talisman in his pocket. The scent of burnt chemicals clung to the air, thick and bitter, making his throat itch. "So," he said, voice taut, "you're telling me that hell decided to move in permanently, and someone forgot to send an eviction notice." Smoke curled from his cigarette, drifting over scattered monitors. She didn't smile. Not just hell. The radiation. It's amplifying spiritual energy. It binds it to matter, transforms it. The longer a soul stays, the stronger it grows. It's a breeding ground. And your friend here. She gestured faintly to the hum of the energy pulsing through the room. Isn't human anymore, or fully dead, or fully alive. And it's learning. Constantine exhaled sharply, smoke curling around his lips. His chest tightened. Heat prickled his scalp, skin tingling as the residual energy in the room resonated faintly against him. He flexed fingers against the sigil, grounding himself. "So the city's a nursery, a prison, and a demon factory all at once," he muttered dryly. "Lovely. Just my kind of Tuesday." Dr. Heller's gaze didn't waver. "You need to understand, Constantine. These aren't just anomalies. They're predictable, in a way. The radiation interacts with magic, with spiritual energy, with human will. The mutations follow patterns. Demons breed, ghouls adapt. The environment itself becomes hostile. The capital Wasteland is alive in ways you aren't ready for." He shifted his weight, boots scraping softly on the warped floor. Fingers brushed against a monitor, feeling warmth from the machinery, rough texture of metal beneath his gloves. His tongue pressed against his teeth, pulse hammering in his ears. He could feel it, the wasteland watching, responding, alive with forces both scientific and arcane. "Right," he said finally, voice low and sardonic. "Radiation plus hell equals Apokolips Deluxe Edition. Got it." Cigarette smoke curled upward, carrying the acrid scent into the charged air. She gestured toward a containment unit glowing faintly green. "This is what you're dealing with. Souls, demons, radiation, and soon everything else that breathes and moves. If you don't understand how they're connected, you'll be next." Constantine's jaw tightened. He ran a hand along the rough edge of a console, grit pressing into his skin. Heat prickled along his arms, pulse vibrating in his fingertips. He exhaled, tasting ash and metal. "Next usually doesn't happen to me. I make a habit of avoiding it." Dr. Heller's eyes glinted with something unreadable. "This time it might. You're not in London anymore. Your usual tricks won't be enough. You need to see the patterns, manipulate the chaos, or you die. Or worse." A low hum pulsed through the room, vibrating through his boots, spine, and skull. Constantine felt the latent energy of the reactor outside, of the wasteland itself, pressing in. The air smelled faintly of burning ozone and chemical rot, tangling with the acrid residue of his cigarette. He took a slow drag, smoke curling around his face, fingers flexed, brushing the talisman again. The hum pressed against him, alive, waiting. He exhaled, voice low, sardonic, but steady. "John Constantine. Right. Radiation plus hell. Spirits trapped. Demons breeding. Got it. Bloody charming." Dr. Heller stepped back, motioning to the monitors. "If you want to survive, Constantine, you need to understand the science and the sorcery. They are two sides of the same curse." He shifted weight, coat brushing against rough concrete, cigarette smoke curling upward, eyes narrowing at the faint green glow, pulse racing. The wasteland was alive, yes, and now he understood why. It wasn't just chaos. It was ordered chaos, deliberate and deadly. Constantine exhaled, tugged his coat tighter, and muttered to himself, voice low, John Constantine. Brilliant. Science and sorcery holding hands over a burning city. Just what I needed. He stepped back into the corridor, ready to move, ready to see the patterns, ready to fight the combined force of hell and fallout. And beneath it all, he felt it, the pulse of something far greater than either, something waiting, patient, and hungry. Concrete vibrated beneath John Constantine's boots, faint and uneven, as if the city itself was breathing. He crouched behind a crumbled wall, cigarette dangling from his lips, smoke curling lazily into the pale light. Every inhale carried the acrid tang of dust, ozone, and something faintly metallic. The hum of machinery from a distant vertibird made his teeth vibrate. Shadows moved in sync with the rotor blades, chopping light into jagged strips across the rubble. Constantine's fingers brushed against the talisman in his coat pocket, cold and ridged, grounding him. From the corner of his eye, movement. A group of armored figures approached, brotherhood of steel soldiers, boots crunching over broken asphalt, rifles slung across their chests. Their armor glinted faintly in the harsh light, insignias sharp, precise. Constantine exhaled slowly, smoke curling around his face. "Ah, you've come to ruin my day," he muttered under his breath, voice dry, sardonic. Fingers twitched, brushing the edge of a jagged beam for balance. The soldiers paused, scanning the street, voices clipped, mechanical radios crackling faintly. "Step out where we can see you," one barked, tone flat and commanding. Constantine shifted, coat brushing concrete, boots crunching softly against debris. Smoke trailed upward, a thin veil masking his position. He rose slowly, hands raised, but empty. Cigarette balanced between fingers, ash clinging. Heat prickled along his forearms as the soldiers adjusted their rifles, the air tense, heavy with anticipation. "You don't look like any weapon I've seen," Constantine said dryly, voice carrying. "Mind if I ask what's in your heads?" The soldiers didn't answer. Instead, one took a cautious step forward, rifle aimed, finger hovering near the trigger. Constantine's pulse ticked faster. His hand flexed, brushing against the talisman, feeling the subtle vibration of latent energy beneath his skin. "Right," he muttered, shifting his weight, coat brushing jagged concrete edges. "Let's do this politely." He flicked his wrist. A faint green flare of magic burst from his palm, arcing toward a nearby generator. Sparks flared, and the machinery groaned, valves twisting under the heat. The soldiers reacted instantly, guns raising, eyes narrowing. Wizard one spat, stepping back, boots crunching against gravel. The others flinched at the flare, some shouting, radios crackling with alarm. Constantine exhaled sharply, smoke curling upward, fingers brushing his talisman again. He didn't wait for them to recover. Another word, guttural, left his lips, and the generator shuddered violently, sparks flying in erratic arcs. The heat radiated, making metal hiss and warp. One soldier moved forward, stepping into the flare. His armor bubbled, sizzling where the magic struck wrong, flesh beneath warping unevenly. He screamed, the sound jagged, sharp, echoing in the hollow street. The others froze, uncertainty flashing across their eyes. Constantine shifted, boots pressing against rubble, coat brushing against concrete dust. Fingers flexed around the talisman, pulse hammering in rhythm with the residual hum of the city. Another soldier raised a rifle, shot ringing out. Constantine ducked instinctively, smoke curling around him, the faint tang of metal and burnt circuits filling his nostrils. Sparks hissed where the bullet ricocheted off warped metal. "Now see," Constantine said dryly, adjusting his coat, cigarette ash falling to the ground. "This is why you don't underestimate a wizard, or at least someone who's good at improvising." The Brotherhood hesitated, scanning the street, calculating, unsure whether to press forward. Constantine shifted again, every movement deliberate. He pressed the talisman, tracing the ridges with his thumb. Heat prickled along his forearms. "Step closer, and I promise you'll regret it," he said. Smoke twisted around his fingers, curling in thin ribbons. The soldiers exchanged glances, uncertainty flickering across their armor plates. Then he spotted the reactor core in the distance, half hidden behind a collapsed wall, faintly glowing green. Impulse struck. Fingers flexed, a small, precise motion. Power surged from his talisman into the core, resonating through the ground, vibrating beneath his boots. Concrete cracked, metal warped in sigil shapes, heat rippling across the street. The soldiers shouted, stepping back. Constantine moved forward with it, coat brushing rubble, boots crunching. The glow from the core expanded, casting jagged shadows, illuminating the street with strange, flickering light. He leaned close, whispering low, murmuring words that twisted reality around the reactor. Sparks jumped from broken wires, light flaring across concrete and steel. The soldiers froze, eyes wide as the marks burned into the ground, forming sharp sigils. Constantine stepped back, cigarette balanced in his fingers, smoke drifting in chaotic curls. The hum of the reactor shifted, pulsing, energy responding to the magic. The Brotherhood's weapons lowered slightly, awe and fear mingling in their stance. "Right," Constantine muttered, tugging at his coat, glancing at the nearest soldier. "Don't make me repeat myself. I don't do sequels well." He turned, boots crunching softly against rubble, coat brushing concrete dust, eyes scanning the street. The hum of the reactor continued, latent energy shimmering, ready. He had made his point, enough to escape, enough to leave scorch marks shaped like warnings. The soldiers hesitated, torn between protocol and the impossible display before them. Constantine exhaled, drawing in smoke, tasting ash and metal, pulse steadying. He flicked the cigarette, sparks scattering over the concrete. Without another word, he stepped past the edge of the reactor glow, boots pressing into rubble, coat brushing against jagged edges, fingers flexing against the talisman. Behind him the soldiers watched, wordless, their radios crackling in disbelief. John Constantine. Well, that was polite enough for a start. Next time I'll bring biscuits. And with that, he disappeared into the ruins, leaving behind scorched sigils, confused soldiers, and a city that had just been reminded magic existed, and it had teeth. The ground dropped away beneath John Constantine's boots, cracked concrete giving way to jagged metal beams and rubble. Dust and ash swirled around his legs as he climbed down into the reactor pit, the air heavy, humid, carrying the metallic tang of exposed wires and scorched stone. Every inhale scratched at his throat, lungs tightening with the sharp taste of ozone and decay. Cigarette dangling loosely from his lips, smoke curling in chaotic spirals. Constantine adjusted the edge of his coat against the jagged rubble. Fingers brushed against the talisman in his pocket, cold and steady against his palm. He exhaled slowly, listening. The pit groaned faintly, distant vibrations traveling through the cracked floor, echoing up the walls. Then he heard it, a low rumble, deep, primal, resonating through the metal and stone. Something massive moved below, claws scraping concrete, shaking loose chunks of debris. Constantine's pulse quickened, nostrils flaring as the air filled with a faint sulphurous tang, the stench of something long dead and alive at once. The Deathclaw Warden emerged from the shadows, massive, scales glinting in the dim reactor light, eyes glowing faintly like molten rock, muscles coiled, tail whipping in warning, claws clicking against the concrete. Its roar shook the pit, echoing in a way that vibrated through Constantine's chest, bones rattling faintly. He crouched low, boots pressing into rubble, coat brushing jagged edges, cigarette ash falling into dust. Fingers flexed, talisman cold in his grip. He didn't flinch, didn't speak, just measured it, reading the creature like one reads an unstable spell. The warden stepped closer, claws scraping, scales clinking, heat radiating off its massive body. Constantine exhaled slowly, smoke curling around him, acrid in the metallic air. The smell of burned flesh and ozone lingered faintly. "Well, you're a bit larger than I imagined," he muttered, voice low, dry. His eyes flicked over the warden's stance, muscles rippling, tail coiled like a whip. "And far less polite than your cousins back in London." The warden hissed, a low vibration pressing against his chest. Constantine shifted weight, boots crunching against concrete shards, coat brushing metal edges, pulse hammering. He reached into his pocket, fingers flexing over the talisman. Blood magic. He muttered words, guttural and precise, a line traced in the dust with sparks curling faintly over the concrete. The warden paused, nostrils flaring, claws lifting slightly. Constantine exhaled smoke, tasting grit and iron. "Right," he said dryly, adjusting the coat, moving a careful step forward. "You want something? I can bargain. Meat, magic, sarcasm. Your choice." A massive claw thumped against the floor, concrete splintering. The warden lowered its head, nostrils flaring, eyes locked on him. Constantine could feel the pulse of its awareness, sharp, predatory. He flexed fingers, tapping the talisman rhythmically, tracing a pattern in the dust. A pair of Brahmin carcasses lay nearby, half burned, half raw. Constantine gestured, words muttered, and the scent wafted faintly toward the warden. Its nostrils twitched, tail curling, claws scraping impatiently. He exhaled sharply, smoke trailing upward, fingers brushing the cold metal of the talisman again. "Food first, then deals," he murmured. "That's diplomacy, my friend. You might want to take notes." The warden lowered its massive head toward the meat, claws clicking against concrete. Constantine stayed motionless, eyes narrowing, coat brushing dust and rubble. He felt the heat radiating off its scales, smelled the iron-tinged sweat, heard the low rumble vibrating in his chest. Once it sniffed and started tearing the Brahmin apart. Constantine muttered another word, tracing faint sigils across the concrete, with sparks curling in short bursts. The warden paused mid-bite, head lifting slightly, eyes catching the glow. He smiled faintly, cigarette balanced between fingers, smoke curling lazily around him. "See, cooperation, mutual benefit," he said softly. "Magic and meat. Works every time." The warden shifted, massive tail sweeping the floor, concrete cracking under its weight. Constantine adjusted his coat, boots pressing into rubble, pulse steadying. Fingers brushed talisman once more, sensing the latent energy in the pit, the reactor hum mingling with the warden's raw primeval power. He stepped closer, careful, measuring, tracing another pattern in the dust. Sparks flared faintly across the concrete, dancing over the edge of jagged metal. The warden's massive eyes followed him, body tense but responsive. Constantine inhaled slowly, smoke curling around his face, tasting grit and ozone. "Right," he muttered, voice low, sardonic. We're friends now. For the record, you're the best bodyguard I've ever hired without a contract." The warden rumbled faintly, tail coiling and uncoiling, claws scraping. Constantine exhaled, taking a slow step back, coat brushing jagged edges, boots pressing firmly into rubble. Smoke drifted upward in chaotic spirals, curling around the faint green glow of the reactor. He had secured his ally, a massive, clawed, scaled ally, and the pit beneath him hummed with energy, alive with the fusion of radiation and residual magic. Constantine flexed fingers against the talisman, pulse steady, chest tightening faintly at the raw awareness surrounding him. "Right," he whispered, voice sardonic, smoke trailing in lazy spirals. "Let's see how deep this rabbit hole really goes." He stepped forward into the pit, the warden following, massive tails sweeping dust and rubble, every movement echoing in the hollow chamber. The reactor hummed, green light shimmering over concrete and steel. Constantine moved carefully, coat brushing jagged surfaces, fingers flexing, cigarette ash falling to the floor. The capital Wasteland waited, dangerous and alive, and now he had muscle backing him up. John Constantine paused at the edge of the crater, boots crunching against brittle concrete, ash sticking to the soles. The air trembled with heat, sharp and metallic, carrying the faint tang of ozone and burnt metal. Smoke drifted lazily in lazy ribbons, curling around his coat and the talisman pressed cold in his palm. He squinted through the haze. Something moved at the center of the pit, a figure, impossibly tall, its body composed of flickering embers and molten light. The ash seraph, wings or what passed for wings, stretched wide, glowing faintly through the smoke, feathers jagged and burning, curling like the edges of scorched paper. The creature tilted its head, eyes glowing like molten gold. Constantine swallowed, tongue tasting ash and iron, pulse thudding in rhythm with the pulsing heat around him. Heat radiated from it, pressing against his skin, making the sweat bead at his temples. Every hair on his arms prickled, coat brushing against rough rubble. "You've come," it said, voice deep and resonant, vibrating through the cracked walls of the pit. Each syllable carried weight, pressing against his chest, a low, oppressive hum. "I have watched. I have waited. Judgment is at hand." Constantine exhaled slowly, smoke curling from his cigarette, acrid and bitter. Fingers flexed against the talisman, pulse quickening. "Ah, right. Judgment. Lovely. And here I was thinking I'd just get a quiet day off." The seraph stepped forward, wings folding slightly, shadows flaring across the pit like liquid fire. Each movement sent shards of heat radiating across the ash-strewn ground. Constantine shifted weight, coat brushing jagged concrete, boots pressing into dust and debris. "You know this world," it said, voice low and melodic, "is already burning. The nukes were merely a mercy, the verdict of a higher order. I am here to finish what was begun." He tapped the talisman, cold metal pressing into his fingers. His jaw tightened, cigarette dangling, smoke curling around his face. The heat prickled along his forearms, sweat running in thin streaks. "Right," he muttered dryly. "And let me guess, you expect me to hand over the keys and bow politely?" The seraph's eyes narrowed, molten light flickering. "You know sin. You have danced with hell and survived. You will understand what must be done, or die trying." Constantine exhaled sharply, smoke trailing upward. Fingers flexed, brushing the talisman again. He adjusted his stance, boots crunching over ash and shards of concrete. His pulse quickened, sensing the latent energy swirling in the pit, every particle of dust vibrating in response. "You've got a flair for dramatics," he muttered. "I can respect that." But I've survived demons with less firepower than you've got on display." He shifted slightly, coat brushing rough edges, pulse hammering in his ears. The seraph leaned forward, heat pressing, wings rustling faintly like paper in a storm. Its voice softened, melodic, dangerous. "Every soul trapped here, every wail, every scream, they are the consequence. And yet you meddle. You are curious, defiant, human in the ways that frustrate me." Constantine smirked, cigarette dangling, smoke trailing in thin arcs. "Human, yes. Defiant, obviously. Frustrating angels since forever, that's my brand." He stepped forward cautiously, boots crunching over dust, coat brushing concrete edges, fingers flexed around the talisman. A pulse of heat radiated from the seraph, pushing him back slightly. Sweat pricked his scalp, lungs tasting metal and ozone. He exhaled slowly, cigarette smoke curling, eyes narrowing. "All right, bright and shiny molten feathered friend," he said, voice low, sardonic. "How about we talk terms before someone, probably me, ends up as an extra in your apokolips show?" The seraph's eyes flared, molten light rippling across wings. "Terms?" it asked, voice resonant, almost amused. "There is no negotiation in judgment, yet you survive where others perish. There is potential." Constantine felt the heat press harder, air vibrating, small debris skittering under his boots. He flexed fingers against the talisman, pulse racing, sweat running down his back. The smell of ozone, burnt concrete, and scorched air wrapped around him. "Potential," he repeated dryly, smoke curling around his face. "Yeah, I've got that. But here's the thing. Earth doesn't need a babysitter, molten feather. And I've got a habit of not giving a damn about cosmic verdicts." The seraph tilted its head, wings folding slightly, heat radiating in waves. Its molten eyes bore into him, vast and ancient, aware of every imperfection, every sin, every calculation. Constantine's pulse quickened, fingers tightening around the talisman, boots pressing into rubble, coat brushing edges of concrete. "You will act," it said finally, voice resonating in the ash-choked pit, "or you will burn." Constantine exhaled, smoke curling lazily upward, tasting grit and metal. He shifted his stance, coat brushing jagged edges, pulse steadying, fingers flexing once more around the cold metal. "John Constantine." "Right. Let's dance then. Just hope you can keep up." The seraph flared suddenly, wings unfolding in a wave of heat and molten light, pressing the air around him into shimmering distortions. Constantine took a step back, boots crunching against dust, coat brushing concrete, fingers twitching with anticipation. The wasteland itself seemed to lean in, waiting, alive with the pulse of radiation, magic, and judgment. And in that moment, Constantine understood fully. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a theological standoff with ash and flame as the referee, and he was about to negotiate with fire. John Constantine moved through the ruined corridors of what was once a sleek enclave facility, boots crunching over scattered wiring and cracked tiles. The faint hum of generators vibrated through the metal floor, sharp and insistent. Air tasted metallic and cold, heavy with the tang of antiseptic that hadn't been used in decades. His coat brushed rough concrete edges as he navigated the shadows, fingers flexing around the talisman in his pocket. Ahead, the faint glow of monitors lit the walls in sickly green and pale blue. Figures moved with clinical precision, enclave scientists and soldiers, armored and alert, eyes flicking across screens that pulsed with schematics and glowing symbols. Each step echoed faintly in the chamber, a soft crunch against debris and wire. Constantine exhaled slowly, smoke curling from his cigarette. acrid against the sterile tang. Dr. Miriam Heller had warned him, but seeing it in motion was worse. A massive chamber at the heart of the facility housed the Ash Seraph, or what the Enclave thought they could control. The creature floated within a containment field, wings folded but still radiating heat, molten feathers flickering against the thick glass of the chamber. Constantine could feel its pulse through the floor, vibrations threading into his boots, rattling his teeth faintly. An Enclave officer barked orders, tone clipped, voice echoing in the sterile space. "Stabilize the reactor field. Increase containment resonance. The Ash Seraph must be harnessed." Constantine stepped closer, boots pressing into shards of concrete, coat brushing rough edges, fingers flexed around the talisman. He smelled ozone, hot metal, and the faintly sweet tang of burning energy. The air hummed with tension, and he could feel the creature inside the field twitching, resisting. "You're planning to weaponize it," he said dryly, cigarette dangling, smoke curling upward. "Big surprise. Humanity always wants to turn the supernatural into a missile." The officer didn't answer, just gestured at the scientists scrambling across consoles, hands flying over holographic panels. Numbers flashed. Energy readings spiked and dropped, sparks sizzling where containment shields strained under the Seraph's presence. Constantine felt the pulse of energy ripple through the floor again, warm and insistent, brushing against his spine. "You don't understand," the officer said finally, voice sharp. "With this power we can dominate the Wasteland, end the chaos, control the fallout, the mutations, everything. The Ash Seraph is our key." Constantine tilted his head, cigarette smoke curling lazily around his face. "Control," he muttered. "Right. Because nukes, mutants, and molten angels have always been so cooperative. Ever thought maybe some things aren't meant to be toys?" A sharp pulse radiated from the containment chamber. The Seraph's wings twitched, molten feathers scraping the glass, heat pressing against Constantine's skin even from this distance. He flexed fingers, talisman cold against his palm. Sparks of residual magic danced faintly across the floor, responding to the latent energy. The officer barked again, forcing a scientist to adjust a console. "Containment must hold. If it breaks, we have the weapon, and the apokolips will be ours to direct." Constantine exhaled sharply, smoke curling, acrid and bitter. Heat prickled his scalp, pulse quickening. He moved closer to the chamber, boots crunching against concrete dust, coat brushing jagged edges. Fingers tapped the talisman rhythmically, tracing faint, invisible sigils. "Apokolips as a hobby, I see," he muttered. "Lovely. Just what I needed. A bunch of tinfoil generals thinking they can leash fire. Why does it never end with just a nice cup of tea?" A low hum vibrated through the chamber, the Seraph's pulse pressing outward, reacting to the chaos and the magic threading beneath the floor. Constantine felt it in his chest, a thrum of raw energy, uncontained and aware. He traced another sigil, careful, precise. Sparks danced across broken metal, tiny arcs of light leaping toward the monitors. One scientist glanced at him, startled. Constantine's eyes met theirs, sharp, unflinching. He flicked his wrist, a small flare of magic arcing across the floor. One console sparked violently, making the scientist yelp. "You see," he said dryly, adjusting his coat, smoke curling around his face. "Some things don't like being caged. Angels, demons, molten or otherwise. And I'm very good at making them notice me." The officer took a cautious step forward, rifle raised, boots crunching on debris. Constantine tilted his head, eyes narrowing, pulse quickening, fingers flexed around the talisman. "You want to harness it? Fine," he muttered under his breath, voice low and sardonic. "But I've got a habit of leaving scorch marks where I go." He traced another sigil, this one bold, sharp, across the metal floor. Sparks flared, light dancing across the chamber, flickering across the seraph's molten feathers. The creature twitched, wings spreading slightly, heat pressing, the air shimmering in response. Constantine stepped back, boots crunching, coat brushing concrete dust, cigarette dangling, smoke curling upward. He let the hum build, feeling it vibrate through his chest. The enclave froze, uncertain, caught between awe and fear. John Constantine. All right, tinfoil generals. Let's see how well you handle a wizard who knows what you're trying to do. With that, he melted into the shadows of the chamber, boots crunching softly, coat brushing jagged metal, fingers flexing, ready to sabotage containment and turn the Enclave's plan against them. John Constantine ducked behind a broken wall, boots pressing into shards of concrete and gravel, coat brushing jagged edges, talisman cold in his pocket. The air vibrated with the roar of gunfire, explosions, and the low hum of a distant vertibird engine. Smoke twisted over scorched earth, acrid and thick, tanging with ozone and the faint metallic tang of blood and irradiated metal. He glanced across the battlefield. Raiders clashed with Brotherhood soldiers, energy rifles flaring, bullets pinging off scrap armor and concrete. Super mutants charged in massive, uneven lines, glowing runes along their arms flaring with each guttural chant. Flames licked the edges of ruined buildings, sending waves of heat across his back. Lovely, Constantine muttered under his breath, cigarette dangling, smoke curling around his face. Just a Tuesday afternoon. Everyone mad, everyone armed, everyone dead set on giving me a headache. A super mutant swung a massive club, sending a human raider flying into a twisted metal beam. Constantine's fingers flexed around his talisman, sparks curling faintly in response. Heat prickled along his forearms, sweat beading beneath the collar of his coat. The smell of scorched clothing, sweat, and ozone pressed into his nose. He moved, careful, boots crunching softly over debris, coat brushing jagged rubble, eyes scanning for leverage. A Brotherhood vertibird swooped low, rotors cutting the thick smoke, blades rattling against air and metal, gunfire pinged upward, ricocheting, sparks leaping off twisted beams. Constantine ducked instinctively, cigarette smoke curling as he muttered, John Constantine. Right, chaos, fire, mutant hordes, and vertibirds. Perfectly manageable. A group of raiders scrambled toward a supply cache, grenades hissing, flames igniting nearby rubble. Constantine flicked his wrist. Sparks flared from the talisman, arcing across the metal, short-circuiting a turret and sending it into a burst of fire. One raider froze, eyes wide, muscles twitching, a scream cut off abruptly. He ducked lower, coat brushing concrete dust, pulse quickening. Super mutants stumbled back, confused by the interference. Brotherhood soldiers hesitated, guns faltering as sparks danced over the metal floor, smoke curling into their visors. Constantine adjusted his stance, fingers tracing invisible sigils in the air, pulse vibrating in rhythm with the chaos. Nearby, a small group of humans had cornered a glowing mutant prophet. Constantine grinned faintly, cigarette dangling, smoke drifting past the edge of the battle. A quick mutter of words, a flick of his wrist, and the prophet's runes flared, sending a pulse that staggered both sides, mutants and humans alike. He stepped past a fallen beam, boots crunching softly, coat brushing jagged edges, pulse hammering. Let's see, he muttered, voice low, sardonic. Who's the bigger headache today? Flames roared higher as a stray energy bolt from a Brotherhood soldier ignited a patch of dry rubble. Smoke thickened, heat pressing against his back, grit clinging to his gloves. Constantine ducked behind a half-collapsed wall, adjusting his coat, exhaling slowly. Sparks danced across metal shards where bullets ricocheted, each arc sending heat prickling along his forearms. A supermutant roared, raising a massive arm, swinging toward a group of raiders. Constantine flicked his wrist, muttered a word, and a burst of magic forced the mutant off balance, sending it crashing into a nearby pile of rubble. Dust and ash puffed into the air, tangling with smoke and the acrid metallic scent of blood. The vertibird swooped again, engines screaming, as Constantine shifted slightly, boots crunching against gravel, coat brushing rough edges. He raised a hand, tracing sigils against the air, sparks leaping faintly across the battlefield. Heat radiated from nearby flames, sweat prickling his scalp. John Constantine. Right. A bit of persuasion here, a little nudge there. And maybe, just maybe, everyone survives long enough to regret this mess. A massive explosion erupted near the reactor cache, flames roaring, heat washing over him in waves. Constantine ducked low, adjusting his stance, talisman pressed cold against his palm. Smoke choked the air, metallic tang thickening. The wasteland itself seemed to hum, alive with energy and chaos. He moved between pockets of debris, boots crunching, coat brushing jagged rubble, cigarette balanced. Sparks danced faintly from his magic, arcs of energy pulsing in time with his heartbeat. Each flick of his wrist manipulated the battlefield subtly, causing mutants to stumble, raiders to hesitate, Brotherhood soldiers to misfire. The pulse of the ash seraph resonated faintly through the ground, heat pressing against his skin, wings flaring somewhere distant, molten light glimpsed through smoke. Constantine flexed fingers against the talisman, pulse quickening, feeling the rhythm of the wasteland respond to the chaos he nudged into motion. A super-mutant swung a jagged club toward him, eyes glowing with fury. Constantine ducked low, coat brushing ash-strewn concrete, muttered a word, and sparks flared from the talisman, scorching the mutant's arm. It roared, staggering back, giving him a clear path. He exhaled sharply, smoke curling around his face, heat prickling his scalp. Around him fire roared, gunfire echoed, mutant roars vibrated, vertibird engines screamed, and Constantine smiled faintly, adjusting his coat. John Constantine. "All right, boys and girls, this is my kind of party. Let's make it messy." With careful steps, precise gestures, and calculated sparks of magic, he maneuvered the battlefield, manipulating chaos like a conductor. Flames roared higher, smoke curled thick, debris tumbled. Mutants, humans, and soldiers alike flinched, staggered and misfired, each pulse of magic bending the fight subtly to his will. And somewhere above, the ash seraph watched, wings flaring faintly, molten eyes following every micro-movement of the human wizard who dared to play puppet with Apokolips. Constantine ducked low again, boots crunching, coat brushing jagged concrete, fingers flexed over his talisman. He exhaled, tasting ash, ozone, and scorched metal. John Constantine. Right, chaos managed. For now. Let's see who breaks first. John Constantine crouched behind a scorched concrete pillar, boots pressing into grit and shards of rusted metal. Smoke stung his eyes, curling around his coat and the talisman cold against his palm. The distant roar of fire mixed with the faint hum of energy from the reactor field, vibrating faintly against his chest. He watched Scrapjack, once ally, now shadowed in betrayal, dart between debris-littered streets. The smuggler's movements were fast, practiced, but something in the flicker of a flame revealed his intent. A makeshift bomb, crudely wired, flicked in his hands. Heat pressed against Constantine's back from nearby flames, tangling with the metallic scent of scorched earth. Bloody hell! Constantine muttered under his breath, cigarette dangling, smoke curling lazily, tasting ash and acrid metal. He exhaled slowly, pulse hammering in rhythm with the distant chaos. Fingers flexed over the talisman, sparks dancing faintly. From across the street, he saw the child he had saved in the settlement, Scene 4, caught in a sudden blast, debris raining. Concrete dust and splintered metal filled the air, pressing against lungs, throat tightening. Constantine's stomach lurched, muscles tensing, eyes narrowing. "Scrapjack," he growled, voice low, venomous. "Really? After everything?" The smuggler paused, expression hidden beneath a soot-streaked hood. He didn't answer, just flicked a switch. The bomb arced toward the small cluster of civilians Constantine had maneuvered into cover. Constantine lunged, boots crunching over concrete and ash, coat brushing jagged edges, fingers tracing a quick sigil in the dust. Sparks flared, arcs of energy cascading along the cracked ground. The bomb fizzed, sputtered, and then erupted harmlessly in a flash of light, scattering debris but leaving the civilians shaken, unscathed. The child coughed, eyes wide, smoke curling around small features, ash clinging to hair. Heat prickled Constantine's arms, pulse racing. He stepped forward, coat brushing against rubble, talisman pressed tight. "You cost me," he muttered under his breath, scanning the battlefield. Super mutants and raiders stumbled around, chaos manipulated by his prior interventions, but the betrayal cut sharper than any sword or claw. Scrapjack hissed something, voice low, muttering as he ducked behind a steel beam, boots crunching on gravel. "Always the puppet master, eh? Thought I'd tip the scales." Constantine's jaw tightened. Smoke curled around his face, acrid and bitter. "Tip the scales? You've just handed me the bloody bookkeeping of regret." He adjusted his stance, boots pressing into rubble, pulse hammering, fingers flexing around the talisman. The battlefield groaned around them. Explosions, gunfire, mutant roars, vertibird engines slicing the air. Constantine exhaled sharply, eyes narrowing, nostrils tasting smoke and scorched metal. Heat prickled along his neck, sweat streaking down his temples. He didn't run. He didn't panic. Every micro-movement, every twitch of fingers, every step over ash and concrete was precise. Sparks danced faintly from the talisman as he traced another sigil, manipulating residual energy. Scrapjack faltered, startled, and Constantine smirked faintly. "Lesson number 1, he muttered dryly, cigarette dangling. "Never forget, friends who betray you tend to get very hot surprises." Before the smuggler could react, a surge of magic arced along the jagged concrete, catching him off guard. Scrapjack yelped, staggering back, boots slipping on ash, coat brushing dust. Constantine advanced cautiously, pulse racing, heat pressing, smell of ozone and burnt metal thickening. But amidst the chaos, Constantine felt the heavier sting, the child's glance, wide and uncertain, lungs tasting smoke. He had saved one life, yes, but the others? Casualties of choices he had already made. His fingers tightened around the talisman, pulse hammering, coat brushing jagged concrete. The battle raged on, mutants and humans colliding in a symphony of fire and noise. Yet in the corner of Constantine's mind, a cold realization settled. Every trick, every manipulation came with a cost. Some debts couldn't be conjured away, some deaths couldn't be avoided. He exhaled sharply, cigarette smoke curling upward, acrid against the stench of ash and blood. Heat prickled his scalp, muscles tensing, pulse hammering. The child clutched his sleeve, small hand trembling. Constantine crouched, coat brushing dust and rubble, smoke curling lazily around his face. He pressed the talisman, sparks flaring faintly, and muttered under his breath, "John Constantine. Right, lesson learned. Next time. I'm keeping the receipts." The battlefield continued to roar around him, chaos unmanaged, allies and enemies alike staggering under his manipulations. But inside, Constantine felt a quiet, burning resolve. The cost of tricks was real, personal, and now unavoidable. He shifted, boots crunching softly, coat brushing jagged concrete, eyes narrowing at the horizon. Every movement, every spark, every breath was deliberate. The Wasteland had taken much al-Repiodi, and Constantine knew, painfully, some of it would never come back. John Constantine stood at the edge of the irradiated plateau, boots crunching on grit and broken concrete, coat brushing jagged metal shards. The air was thick, still, dead even, carrying the acrid tang of dust and ozone, without the usual hum of energy or the subtle itch of spectral presence he had grown used to. He flicked his cigarette, smoke curling in spirals that seemed to vanish into the blank, oppressive air. Every inhale felt heavier, a metallic tang clinging to his throat. Fingers flexed around his talisman, cold against his palm, sparks dancing faintly but failing to find purchase. "Right," he muttered, voice low, sardonic. "No whispers, no shadows, no screaming little sods asking me to fix their eternal mess. Lovely. A proper wasteland quiet. You'd think hell'd have a bloody post office here at least." He muttered words under his breath, tracing sigils in the dust, sparks arcing faintly, but the usual tremble, the pull of demonic recognition, was absent. The talisman pulsed faintly, cold, distant, unresponsive. Heat prickled along his arms, not from magical fire, but from frustration pressing against his spine. "Of course," Constantine said, voice tight, cigar-like smoke curling around his lips. "Welcome to spiritual quarantine. Hell can't touch you, I can't touch hell, and everyone's stuck playing solo. Just bloody perfect." He took careful steps across the plateau, boots crunching against ash and rubble, coat brushing against shards of concrete. Every movement echoed in the still air, magnified in the silence. The usual resonance, the faint vibration of trapped souls beneath the earth, the tug of lingering energy. It was gone. Nothing responded. Not the wasteland, not hell, not even the latent demons he had summoned here and there. Cigarette ash fell to the cracked ground. Constantine exhaled slowly, heat prickling along his scalp, throat tight. His pulse thudded in time with the oppressive stillness. He crouched briefly, fingers brushing the talisman, sparks faint and lazy. "I suppose that's supposed to be comforting," he muttered, sarcasm thin, voice low. "Or terrifying. Couldn't decide which, really." In the distance, he glimpsed twisted remnants of pre-war buildings, skeletal frames silhouetted against the hazy, irradiated light. No whisper of ghosts, no shimmer of spectral civilians. The wasteland had swallowed them, or perhaps they had nowhere to go. Constantine's teeth pressed against the cigarette filter. He tapped the talisman, murmuring another word, sparks flickering weakly. Nothing. The air remained dead, unyielding. Sweat pricked his temple, dust clinging to damp hair. "Of course you've locked yourself out," he muttered under his breath. "Hell, heaven, all the celestial sods. I'm alone. Lucky me. Guess that makes me the designated fire department, cleanup crew, and middle management all in one." He paced slowly, coat brushing rubble, boots crunching over ash-strewn metal, pulse hammering faintly in his ears. Fingers flexed against the talisman, sparks dancing faintly, failing to find purchase on anything alive or sentient. Heat prickled along his arms, throat dry, lungs tasting grit and ozone. A faint wind whispered over the plateau. carrying the sharp, metallic tang of irradiated dust. Constantine paused, smoke curling around his face, nostrils flaring, pulse hammering. No response, no pulse from the wasteland itself. Just oppressive silence and the weight of being entirely on his own. He crouched once more, coat brushing jagged concrete, cigarette dangling, smoke trailing upward in lazy spirals. Fingers tapped the talisman. John Constantine. Right. Brilliant. No allies, no hell, no heaven, no bloody one to call. Just me, a radioactive sandbox, and my charming self. Could be worse, could be raining molten feathers. A distant rumble shook the plateau faintly. Not magical, not demonic, just the slow shift of ruined earth under the weight of a dead city. Constantine exhaled, smoke curling, coat brushing rubble, pulse steadying. He flexed fingers once more around the talisman, sparks weak but persistent. He straightened, boots crunching against concrete, eyes narrowing at the horizon. The wasteland stretched before him, silent, dead, and unyielding. But beneath it he felt the latent pulse of possibility, faint and stubborn. Isolation, yes, but opportunity too. John Constantine. Well, then, looks like it's just you and me. Wasteland. And I don't plan on losing to dust. Cigarette smoke drifted over the cracked plateau, acrid against the metallic tang of the air. Heat prickled along his arms, coat brushing jagged concrete, boots crunching softly. The silence pressed. But Constantine pressed back, talisman cold, pulse racing, ready to carve a path through the spiritually quarantined wasteland, alone. John Constantine stepped over shattered asphalt, boots crunching faintly on debris that seemed both solid and unreal beneath his weight. His coat brushed jagged edges of broken concrete, carrying dust that clung to his sleeves. The air shimmered faintly, cold and heavy, smelling of burnt ozone and faint decay, carrying the faint tang of something intangible, soul stench if he had to name it. Buildings loomed like skeletal husks, edges warped, windows empty eyes, walls flickering with faint translucent echoes of life long gone. The streets were silent, except for the faint whisper of 1,000 voices, too soft to catch words but insistent, pressing against his ears and chest. Constantine's pulse thudded in rhythm with the subtle vibration under his boots, subtle tremors of trapped souls shifting beneath cracked concrete. He exhaled, cigarette dangling, smoke curling in lazy spirals, tasting ash and metal. Fingers brushed the talisman in his pocket, cold against the skin, sparks dancing faintly across invisible threads. He muttered under his breath, tracing a sigil in the air, but the usual hum of magic seemed muffled here, dulled by the weight of so many trapped spirits. Right, he muttered dryly, voice low, sardonic. Not quite hell, not quite home. Just your local ghost town. Population, everyone who didn't get out in time. A flicker of movement caught his eye. A ghostly woman, pale and drifting, clothes ripped and stained with faint soot. Her eyes held nothing but pleading. Constantine's stomach twisted, the metallic tang in his throat thickening. He stepped closer cautiously, boots crunching on ash-strewn asphalt, coat brushing jagged debris. "Don't," he muttered under his breath, hands tightening around the talisman. "I can help, yes, but I'm no miracle worker, and if I start crying for everyone..." He shook his head, cigarette smoke curling over his brow, exhaled sharply. Ghosts shifted around him, thousands of them now, spectral figures moving between buildings, flickering faintly in and out of existence. Whispers pressed against his mind, tugging, pleading, desperate. Heat prickled along his arms, not warmth, but the raw pressure of longing and fear pressed into his nerves. A child appeared, translucent, small hand reaching for him. He crouched slightly, coat brushing dust, boots pressing into broken asphalt, pulse hammering faintly. John Constantine. "All right, mate. Let's not start with tears just yet. I'm good, sorta, kind of." He flexed his fingers against the talisman. Sparks arced faintly, tracing over shards of concrete and metal. Ghosts recoiled slightly, not in pain, but startled, awareness flickering in their faded forms. Constantine moved forward carefully, eyes scanning, every step deliberate, coat brushing ash and rubble. Thousands of spectral figures now pressed closer, silent, eyes empty but pleading, bodies flickering like candle flames in windless halls. The weight of their trapped essence pressed on him, pulse racing, muscles tight, heat prickling along his neck and forearms. He exhaled sharply, smoke curling, tasting ash and metal, nostrils flaring. Fingers tapped the talisman, tracing precise lines in the air. Sparks leapt faintly, interacting with the trapped souls, threads of energy brushing against them without harming, just nudging awareness. "You want me to stay?" he muttered dryly, voice low. "Because that's not exactly on my schedule. You know, hellfire, demon deals, apocalyptic angels. Busy, busy, busy." A chorus of whispers surged around him, pressing, tugging at his mind, hundreds of tiny nudges of need and despair. Constantine's pulse throbbed against the talisman, coat brushing jagged debris, boots pressing firmly into cracked asphalt. Heat prickled, lungs tasting metallic ash. He crouched slightly, talisman in hand, eyes narrowing at the sea of pleading faces. Sparks flared faintly, arcing over shards of rubble, tracing delicate sigils in the air, nudging awareness, holding back the tide of despair without releasing it fully. John Constantine. "Right, not leaving you to rot. Completely. But don't expect miracles. And I don't do happy endings. Not my brand." He rose slowly, coat brushing concrete dust, boots crunching, pulse steadying despite the oppressive weight. The ghosts pressed closer, silent, flickering in and out, heat from nearby fires brushing against his back, air thick with ozone and ash. Constantine exhaled. Cigarette smoke curling upward, acrid and bitter. The wasteland stretched beyond, dead and irradiated, but here, this spectral DC, trapped souls painted the streets with pleading and despair. And Constantine, ever sardonic, ever reluctant, would step carefully through it, talisman in hand, smoke curling, ready to navigate the weight of thousands of lost lives, and still find his way forward. John Constantine. "Well, ghosts, you've got my attention. Let's hope you don't follow me home." He moved on, boots crunching, coat brushing jagged concrete, sparks from his talisman arcing faintly, pulse steady, mind racing. The ghost city waited restless, alive in its spectral silence, and Constantine felt the full burden of being its unwilling intermediary. John Constantine crouched at the edge of the reactor chamber, boots pressing into shards of scorched concrete, coat brushing jagged metal. The air was thick with heat and ozone, acrid and biting, carrying the faint metallic tang of blood and burnt circuitry. The reactor's core hummed low, a living heartbeat beneath the floor, vibrating faintly against his chest. Dr. Miriam Heller knelt beside the containment field, hands slick with dark coagulated blood from a freshly opened vein. Her lab coat was scorched at the edges, soot clinging to her hair and skin, sweat streaking her face. She muttered words under her breath, tracing precise lines over the reactor's casing with her fingers. Sparks of magic danced faintly along the edges, curling like smoke, blending with the hum of radiation. Constantine's pulse thudded in his ears, boots pressing over metal and concrete, coat brushing jagged debris. He exhaled slowly, cigarette dangling, smoke curling around his face, acrid and bitter. His fingers traced a sigil in the air, talisman cold against his palm. "Right," he muttered dryly, voice low, sardonic. "This is it. Big show, molten feathers, nuclear playground, and you, Miriam, doing your last trick. Lovely." She glanced at him, eyes steady, pulse racing faintly. "It has to be done, John," she said, voice tight. "Without this, everything dies. You, them, the wasteland. The ash seraph can't be contained otherwise." Constantine's jaw tightened, tasting the tang of ash and ozone in his mouth. Heat prickled along his forearms, sweat streaking his temples. Yeah, I get it. Big sacrificial heroics, world-saving shtick. Just hate the part where someone else dies first. Her hands trembled faintly as she poured more blood over the reactor core, each drop hissing as it struck the irradiated metal. Sparks flared, green light shimmering over the chamber, shadows flickering against jagged debris. The seraph's pulse thrummed faintly through the floor, wings flaring in distant molten anticipation. "I don't have a choice," Miriam whispered, voice almost lost under the reactor's hum. She met his gaze briefly, small smile flickering. "I've lived my time. This is enough." Constantine exhaled sharply, smoke curling, eyes narrowing, pulse hammered, heat pressing against his back. Boots shifted on rubble, coat brushing dust and ash. He crouched lower, fingers flexing around the talisman, sparks leaping faintly along the floor. "You've got more nerve than half the bastards I've cursed into eternity," he muttered. "Right, you're the good sort. Don't let it make me cry, all right?" The first flames flared along the edges of the reactor, licking at exposed metal, heat pressing hard against his neck. Sparks danced along the floor in response to the talisman's magic, nudging energy, stabilizing the fragile lines Miriam had traced. Every inhalation carried the metallic tang of irradiated blood and scorched stone. Miriam whispered the final words, voice low, precise, tremor just beneath her control. The reactor hummed louder, heat pressing, vibrating through the floor, tangling with the latent energy of magic and molten power. Constantine's fingers tightened, pulse hammering, coat brushing ash and concrete, boots pressing into rubble. Suddenly, a massive tremor shook the chamber. Sparks arced from exposed conduits, flickering over the concrete and steel, smell of ozone and scorched wiring filling his nostrils. He glanced at Miriam, her hands pressed to the reactor, blood flowing over metal, pulse racing, eyes closed, lips moving in faint mutterings. John Constantine. Right, that's it. Heart in mouth, fingers on fire, apokolips tick-tock. Perfect. He stepped closer, coat brushing jagged edges, boots crunching softly over debris, pulse racing, eyes on the blood flowing over the core. Sparks leapt faintly in response to his talisman, fingers tracing sigils in the air. Heat prickled along his arms, sweat beading, lungs tasting grit and metal. Miriam gasped faintly, trembling before collapsing forward. Blood seeping into the reactor's core. Sparks flared violently, green light shimmering across jagged walls, shadows dancing over concrete and steel. Constantine stumbled slightly, coat brushing dust, pulse hammering. The weight of her sacrifice pressed on him, visceral, sharp, leaving a hollow ache beneath ribs. "Christ," he muttered, voice tight, cigarette dangling, smoke curling lazily. She didn't have to. Bloody hell. The reactor's hum intensified, a low roar vibrating through the chamber, pushing heat against skin, pulse racing, metal and concrete trembling beneath boots. Constantine exhaled sharply, fingers flexing around the talisman, sparks dancing along the floor. He crouched, coat brushing debris, pulse hammering, eyes narrowing at the green glow radiating from the reactor. The ritual had begun. Energy pulsed, molten and magical, and the ash seraph stirred faintly in response, wings flaring in distant anticipation. Every tremor, every flicker, every hiss of irradiated blood and sparks pressed against Constantine's senses. John Constantine. Right. No turning back now. One shot, one ritual, one chance to keep this world from frying entirely. And I do not fail. Not now. He adjusted his stance, coat brushing ash-strewn concrete, boots crunching over rubble, pulse steadying against the chaos, fingers tracing sigils in the air. Sparks leapt faintly across the reactor casing, green light flickering, molten and alive. The weight of Miriam's sacrifice pressed against him, heavy and undeniable, but necessity left no room for grief. Not yet. Cigarette smoke curled around his face, acrid and bitter, lungs tasting grit and ozone. He exhaled, coat brushing jagged concrete, pulse racing, talisman cold against his palm. The ritual was set, the world teetering, and Constantine would step into the fire fully aware of the stakes. Death, damnation, or worse. John Constantine. Right. Time to dance with Helen Nukes then, and hope I make it out with both lungs intact. John Constantine crouched atop the Deathclaw's massive back, claws crunching over jagged concrete and ash-strewn rubble. The creature's hide radiated heat, slick and rough beneath his palms, pulse of raw power vibrating against his forearms. Smoke and radioactive haze whipped around them, tangling with the metallic bite of scorched metal in the air. The reactor pit yawned ahead, molten light spilling across jagged walls, humming with lethal energy. The ash seraph hovered above, wings flaring, molten and jagged, molten light rippling against the thick haze. Heat pressed against Constantine's back, sweat streaking his temples, lungs tasting grit and acrid ozone. "All right, big guy," he muttered, voice low, sardonic, cigarette dangling, smoke curling in lazy spirals. "Let's see if we can crash a little celestial party. With style. Preferably with fewer explosions in my trousers." The Deathclaw's claws dug into fractured concrete, shaking the ground. Sparks leapt from contact points where metal and stone met. Constantine's fingers flexed around the talisman, tracing a quick sigil along the creature's spine. Heat prickled along his arms, pulse hammering, coat brushing rough, jagged edges of debris. He exhaled sharply, smoke curling, acrid and bitter. The creature roared, low and guttural, vibrations pressing through his legs, spine, chest. The wasteland trembled with the resonance, echoes rippling across broken buildings and ruined streets. Above, the ash seraph flared wings, molten feathers scraping the air, heat pressing against his face, its molten eyes locked on him, unyielding, ancient, and aware. Constantine adjusted his stance, boots pressing lightly against the Deathclaw's thick hide, pulse racing, coat brushing jagged edges. "Right," he muttered dryly, voice low, sardonic. "Apocalypse angel, molten wings, radioactive lizard. Time to dance. Yes?" He traced a sigil in the air, sparks arcing faintly, nudging the latent energy in the reactor pit toward unstable resonance. The Deathclaw lunged forward, claws tearing across the rubble, roar vibrating, heat pressing against Constantine's back, pulse hammering in tandem with the creature's heartbeat. The ash seraph descended, wings flaring, molten light lashing out. Sparks of magic leapt from Constantine's talisman, arcing toward the creature, nudging its trajectory. Heat, light, and radioactive haze pressed against him in waves, coat brushing ash and concrete, lungs tasting grit and metal. Bullets, energy bolts, and the roar of distant explosions filled the air. The Deathclaw crashed through debris, sending clouds of dust and ash swirling. Constantine leaned low, talisman cold against his palm, fingers tracing precise lines in the air, manipulating sparks and energy. "Oi," he muttered, voice tight, pulse racing. "Try not to eat the angel, yeah? Just crash and burn politely." The seraph flared, wings slicing through smoke, molten feathers raking air. The Deathclaw lunged into the reactor pit, claws gouging jagged concrete, molten light reflecting off its hide. Heat pressed against Constantine's neck, sweat streaking his forehead, lungs tasting ozone and scorched metal. He muttered a quick incantation, sparks leaping from his talisman, nudging the Ash Seraph's trajectory ever so slightly. Wings flared, molten feathers clashing with energy arcs, sparks dancing across the jagged walls of the pit. The air vibrated, thick with ozone dust and the metallic tang of molten ash. The Deathclaw roared again, vaulting over a ridge of rubble, claws gouging molten streaked concrete. Constantine leaned forward, coat brushing jagged edges, pulse hammering, fingers flexing around the talisman. Sparks leapt, arcs of green magic weaving over molten light, nudging the balance between life, death, and apocalypse. "Right," he muttered dryly, cigarette dangling, smoke curling. "Let's finish this mess before someone, probably me, gets fried into toast." They slammed into the reactor chamber, concrete shattering, molten light flaring, energy arcs dancing wildly. The Ash Seraph roared, wings flaring in molten fury, heat pressing, pulse racing, lungs tasting grit and ozone. Constantine shifted, tracing sigils, nudging sparks into chaos, manipulating the clash between molten angel and radioactive lizard. Explosions, fire, molten feathers, and arcs of magic roared together. The Deathclaw struck, claws gouging deep into the reactor floor, roaring. Constantine leaned low, coat brushing jagged concrete, pulse hammering, talisman cold against his palm, sparks dancing over molten chaos. "All right," he muttered, voice tight, sardonic, smoke curling around his face. "This is why I don't do holidays. Pure chaos. And it's brilliant." The reactor pulsed violently, molten light and magic arcs intertwining. The Ash Seraph struggled, wings flaring, molten feathers splintering in sparks. The Deathclaw roared again, claws tearing, vibration pressing against Constantine's chest, pulse racing. And in that moment, perched atop Apocalypse incarnate, Constantine laughed faintly, smoke curling, coat brushing jagged debris, pulse hammering in tandem with the Wasteland itself. John Constantine. Right. Let's see who survives this mess. John Constantine crouched on a slab of molten streaked concrete, boots pressing into ash and splintered metal, coat brushing jagged debris. The air shimmered with heat and ozone, tang of scorched steel and burnt blood heavy in his nostrils. Sparks of his talisman flickered faintly, dancing over the molten light spilling from the reactor below. Above, the Ash Seraph hovered, wings flaring molten fury, feathers trailing embers like liquid fire. The creature's eyes, bright as molten cores, locked on him, radiating judgment, fury, and something infinitely older. Heat pressed hard against Constantine's back, pulse hammering in rhythm with the reactor, lungs tasting grit, metal, and fire. "All right, feathered menace," Constantine muttered, voice low, sardonic, cigarette dangling, smoke curling in lazy spirals. "You've got wings, molten fury, and a divine attitude. Let's talk theology before someone dies horribly." The seraph flared its wings, molten light cascading across jagged walls, heat pressing against skin, tendrils of smoke curling from singed concrete. Its voice, low and resonant, rumbled through the air, vibrating through Constantine's boots and chest. Ash Seraph. You cannot stop what has been decreed. Nukes were judgment, fire is law, and the earth shall be cleansed. Constantine exhaled sharply, tasting metallic ash and ozone. Heat prickled along his arms, sweat streaking temples, pulse hammering. Fingers flexed around the talisman, sparks arcing faintly, nudging latent energy in the air. John Constantine. Yeah. Cleansing fire, apokolips verdicts. All very dramatic, but here's the thing. Free will, humans have it. Even you can't just stamp it out with molten feathers and celestial fury. The seraph shifted slightly, wings flaring, molten feathers scraping the cracked walls, heat pressing against Constantine's face. Sparks from the talisman leapt faintly, dancing across jagged debris, nudging the air with magic. As a seraph, judgment is perfection. Your free will is flawed, weak. I am the hand that balances the scales. Constantine leaned low, coat brushing ash-strewn concrete, pulse racing, lungs tasting grit and metal, fingers tracing sigils in the air. Sparks arced, nudging energy between molten wings and radioactive rubble. John Constantine. Balance. You call nukes, mutants, and melted cities balance. Mate, that's chaos dressed up in a fancy coat. You're not the universe's accountant. You're a winged meltdown. The ash seraph flared wings violently, molten light ripping across the chamber, heat pressing, pulse hammering against Constantine's chest. Sparks from his talisman arced higher, nudging molten feathers, twisting their trajectory. Concrete cracked beneath the strain, dust and ash curling into the thick, irradiated haze. A Sh Seraph. You. Question the judgment. You. Human? John Constantine. Bloody right, I question it. Because humans burn, die, fight, and make mistakes. And that's called living. You? You're just an overcooked angel with a god complex. The seraph descended, wings flaring, molten feathers raking the air, heat pressing hard, lungs tasting grit and ozone, pulse hammering in time with every flicker of molten light. Constantine ducked, coat brushing jagged concrete, sparks dancing faintly, nudging arcs of energy between himself and the creature. John Constantine. And here's the kicker. You can rage, flare, and threaten all you want. But free will means I get a say too. And I say, you don't get to torch this place. Sparks leapt violently now, dancing across molten light, twisting air and shadows. Concrete cracked further, heat pressing, pulse hammering, lungs tasting ash and metal. The ash seraph recoiled slightly, wings flaring in molten anger, molten feathers sputtering against arcs of magic. A Sh Seraph. Then you shall burn, human. Constantine grinned faintly, coat brushing ash-strewn concrete, pulse racing, cigarette dangling, smoke curling around his face, fingers flexed around the talisman, sparks arcing with every deliberate flick. John Constantine. Fine. But remember this, Featherface. I've danced with worse than molten angels, nukes, and moral certainties. You're just my latest headache. He traced another sigil, sparks leaping over jagged debris, nudging molten feathers, twisting energy toward the reactor's core. Heat pressed, lungs tasting grit and metallic ash, pulse hammering in tandem with the molten chaos. The ash seraph flared again, wings cutting arcs of molten light, but Constantine's magic bent the dance, nudging the creature, testing limits, pressing boundaries. John Constantine. Right. Let's see how well you handle someone who refuses to kneel, even when the world's on fire. The molten wings flared higher, light reflecting off jagged concrete, smoke and ash curling thickly. Constantine exhaled sharply, pulse racing, coat brushing debris, fingers tracing sigils, sparks arcing over molten and magical energy. This was it, the theological showdown, the test of free will against apocalyptic judgment, and he wasn't going down quietly. John Constantine crouched on the edge of the reactor chamber, boots pressing into molten streaked concrete, coat brushing jagged debris. The air was thick with heat, ozone, and the metallic tang of scorched steel, tangling with a faint, acrid scent of blood and ash. Sparks danced faintly from his talisman, tracing arcs over the glowing reactor core, nudging raw energy in precise, chaotic patterns. The ash seraph hovered above, wings flaring molten light, molten feathers trailing sparks like liquid fire. Its molten eyes burned, judgment incarnate, wings slicing through the thick haze, heat pressing against his back, pulse hammered, lungs tasting grit and ozone. "Right," Constantine muttered under his breath, cigarette dangling, smoke curling around his face. "Time to pull the ultimate con. Feathers, fire, molten fury, and you, angel, are my mark." He traced a sigil in the air, sparks leaping toward the reactor's unstable field. Heat prickled along his arms, coat brushing jagged edges, pulse hammering. The ash seraph flared wings, molten feathers lashing against arcs of energy, molten light reflecting off concrete shards. A SH seraph. You cannot deceive the inevitable. Constantine smirked faintly, crouching lower, talisman cold against his palm. Deceive? Nah, just redirect, twist, nudge a little. He flicked his wrist, sparks arcing over molten and magical energy, tracing subtle threads toward the reactor. The seraph descended, wings flaring violently, molten feathers splintering into arcs of embers, heat pressing against Constantine's face, lungs tasting metallic ash, pulse racing, coat brushing debris, boots crunching softly on rubble. "Here's the bit you didn't see coming," he muttered dryly, voice low, sardonic. Fingers flexed over the talisman, sparks arcing like miniature lightning, nudging molten feathers toward precise points of resonance. The ash seraph shrieked, molten light rippling, wings flaring, molten feathers striking arcs against the chamber walls. Constantine leaned forward, tracing intricate sigils in the air, nudging energy across the reactor core and the seraph's own molten aura. John Constantine. Right. Eyes on the shiny bits. Heart in the right place. Wings flapping. Molten angel about to meet radioactive physics. Sparks leapt higher, arcs of magic twisting, nudging the molten feathers toward the reactor's field. Heat pressed, sweat streaking his temples, lungs tasting grit and ozone. The seraph roared, wings flaring, molten feathers striking arcs of light, but Constantine's manipulation guided them toward precise resonance points. A SH seraph. You cannot contain me. Contain? Nah, Constantine muttered, voice low, sardonic. Redirect, bind, trap, same thing. Different wrapping paper. He crouched lower, talisman cold against his palm, sparks arcing violently, nudging molten energy into a binding pattern across the reactor field. The ash seraph lunged, wings flaring, molten feathers scraping concrete, heat pressing hard, pulse hammering in his chest. Constantine traced the final sigil, sparks arcing, nudging molten light into a trap, twisting molten feathers and reactor energy into a constricting lattice. The molten wings flared violently, seraph shrieking, molten light fracturing against arcs of magic, heat pressing, lungs tasting metallic ash. Constantine exhaled sharply, cigarette dangling, smoke curling lazily, pulse racing. John Constantine. Right. You fly, you fight, you flare. But I play. The long con, mate. And this is the long con. With a final flick of his wrist, sparks leapt from the talisman into the molten lattice. The reactor field pulsed violently, arcs of molten and magical energy locking the ash seraph in place. Wings flared, molten feathers sputtering, molten light straining, then stilled. Heat pressed against Constantine's back, pulse hammering, lungs tasting ash and ozone. The ash seraph hovered, trapped, molten light flickering, wings folded tight, molten feathers pinned by invisible chains of energy and magic. It shrieked once, long and furious, then fell silent, molten light, dimming. Constantine straightened, coat brushing jagged edges, boots crunching softly over rubble, pulse racing, talisman cold but humming faintly. He exhaled, cigarette smoke curling around his face, acrid and bitter. John Constantine. Right. Long con. Complete. Winged apokolips. Contained. And no bloody one else needed to die in the process. Well, mostly. He glanced at the reactor, sparks still dancing faintly over jagged metal, molten light reflecting across the walls. Sweat streaked his temples, lungs tasting grit and ozone. The ash seraph, trapped, burned faintly in molten silence, wings flaring weakly, bound by the human wizard's cunning. Not bad for a Monday, Constantine muttered dryly, coat brushing ash-strewn concrete, pulse hammering. Fingers flexed around the talisman, sparks leaping faintly, nudging residual energy. The wasteland outside trembled faintly, molten and magical energy humming in the reactor. Constantine exhaled sharply, cigarette dangling, smoke curling upward. John Constantine. Right. Job done. Now for the cleanup. John Constantine trudged through the rubble-strewn streets, boots crunching over ash, concrete shards, and twisted metal. His coat brushed jagged debris, dust clinging to damp fabric. The air was thick with the acrid tang of burnt ozone, molten metal, and faint radiation, carrying the distant hum of a wasteland settling into uneasy silence. The reactor's glow had dimmed, now a faint green pulse beneath cracked concrete, resonating softly with the talisman in Constantine's palm. Sparks arced faintly from it, tracing lazy patterns across jagged debris, coaxing the remnants of molten energy into quiet submission. Heat pressed gently along his arms, lungs tasting ash and grit. Around him, the chaos he'd helped orchestrate had left its mark. Raiders limped away, muttering curses, hands pressed to burns and bloodied wounds. Supermutants staggered into the dust, glowing runes fading with exhaustion, muscles trembling from the strain of battle. Brotherhood vertibirds hovered briefly, engines whining, then lifted away, pilots grim and silent. Ghosts drifted faintly in the distance, thousands of spectral civilians who had haunted DC. They flickered in and out of sight, pale and whispering, eyes bright but quiet. Slowly their forms began to fade, their presence softening into the irradiated air, leaving only echoes of whispers that brushed against Constantine's ears. He exhaled, cigarette dangling, smoke curling lazily, acrid and bitter, pulse hammering, coat brushing jagged concrete, talisman cold but faintly humming. Every inhalation carried the metallic tang of ash and ozone. He adjusted his stance, fingers flexing around the talisman, sparks dancing faintly over the broken concrete. John Constantine. Right, that's it then. Factions scattered, angels pinned, ghosts fading, quiet. Lovely, isn't it? Except it smells like burnt everything and despair. But yeah, that's normal. He stepped over a collapsed wall, concrete cracking beneath boots, coat brushing debris. In the distance, a small group of civilians emerged from rubble, blinking against the harsh light, dust clinging to hair and clothes. Some muttered thanks, others stared wide-eyed at the destruction. Constantine gave a faint nod, cigarette smoke curling, pulse steadying. Mutant and human alike avoided his path, giving space to the wizard who had manipulated chaos, twisted fate, and bent molten angels to his will. The wasteland breathed around him, tremors fading, dust settling, molten and magical energy quieting beneath the reactor. He crouched briefly, coat brushing ash, sparks from the talisman flickering faintly, nudging residual energy into a slow, controlled decay. Heat pressed faintly against his back, lungs tasting grit and metallic ash. Every movement deliberate, careful, cautious. John Constantine. All right then, everyone survives. Mostly. Ghosts gone. Mutants, raiders, brotherhood am I scattered. Fallout continues, Wasteland lives, job done. Well, as done as it ever gets. He exhaled sharply, smoke curling over his face, acrid and bitter. Pulse steady, coat brushing debris, talisman humming faintly. He shifted weight, boots crunching softly over cracked asphalt, jagged metal underfoot. Silence pressed, but it was different now. Less oppressive, more empty, a quiet echo of survival. The ghosts had faded, the factions scattered, molten angels contained, but the cost remained. Constantine felt it deep, a hollow ache beneath ribs. Sweat streaked his temples, lungs tasting ozone and ash. Every breath a reminder of choices, loss, and the tenuous balance he'd forced upon the wasteland. He straightened, coat brushing jagged edges, pulse steadying, cigarette smoke curling. Sparks leapt faintly from the talisman, fading slowly. The reactor hummed softly beneath cracked concrete, molten light dimming, energy contained, chaos resolved, for now. John Constantine. Right. After the fire. Someone has to walk through the ashes. Might as well be me. He took a deliberate step forward, boots crunching over ash and debris, coat brushing rubble, talisman cold but humming faintly. The wasteland stretched ahead, quiet, irradiated, scarred but alive, and Constantine, pulse steady, cigarette dangling, lungs tasting grit and metal, walked through it all, survivor, manipulator, reluctant savior. John Constantine leaned against a crumbling wall, boots pressed into dust and shards of concrete, coat brushing jagged debris. The air was thick with ash and the faint metallic tang of scorched steel, carrying the subtle warmth of lingering radiation. The reactor's glow pulsed faintly beneath the ruins, casting long, wavering shadows across the cracked streets. He exhaled sharply, cigarette dangling from his lips, smoke curling in slow spirals, acrid and bitter. Fingers flexed around the talisman in his pocket, sparks dancing faintly over jagged concrete, nudging residual energy into quiet obedience. Pulse steadied, lungs tasting grit, ozone, and faint ash. The wasteland stretched before him, quiet now, fractured and scarred, but breathing. Buildings leaned like exhausted sentinels, twisted metal glinting faintly in the dim light. Piles of rubble and cracked asphalt stretched in every direction, irradiated and silent. Mutants, raiders, and remnants of the Brotherhood had dispersed or perished. But the air carried the weight of survival, of a world forced back from the edge. Constantine exhaled again, smoke curling around his face, coat brushing jagged edges, pulse steady. He crouched slightly, pressing the talisman into his palm, sparks leaping faintly, tracing lazy patterns over debris. The reactor hummed softly, molten light dimming beneath cracked concrete, energy contained, chaos resolved. He glanced at the horizon, eyes narrowing, pulse hammering faintly with a familiar mixture of sarcasm and weary acceptance. Ghosts had faded, angels had been trapped, factions scattered. All that remained was the slow, radioactive heartbeat of the wasteland, and him, John Constantine. Well, looks like it's just you and me then. Lovely, isn't it? Apokolips survived, angels pinned, factions scattered, and I get to keep my lungs. Mostly. He lit the cigarette fully, inhaling slowly, smoke curling over his face, acrid and bitter. Fingers tapped the talisman against his palm, sparks dancing faintly, nudging molten energy into submission, coaxing the remnants of chaos to rest. Heat prickled along his arms, lungs tasting ash and metallic tang, pulse steadying. Boots pressed into ash-strewn rubble, coat brushing jagged debris. He exhaled slowly, watching the smoke drift lazily over the cracked streets, acrid against the faint warmth of the radioactive air. The wasteland was quiet, scarred, irradiated, but alive. And he, John Constantine, was its reluctant, sardonic witness. John Constantine. Guess I live here now. He took a slow drag, smoke curling around his face, acrid and bitter. Pulse steadied, coat brushing jagged concrete, boots pressing into rubble. The reactor hummed faintly, molten light pulsing, sparks from his talisman flickering in quiet rhythm. The wasteland stretched endlessly ahead, irradiated and scarred, but surviving. Constantine exhaled once more, cigarette smoke curling into the dim radioactive haze, lungs tasting grit, ash, and metal. He shifted slightly, coat brushing debris, pulse steady, talisman cold against his palm. Every breath, every movement, every spark was deliberate. And in the ruins of a world burned, twisted, and judged, John Constantine remained, alone, sardonic, alive, and strangely at home. He flicked ash from the cigarette, sparks leaping faintly across broken concrete, nudging molten energy beneath the reactor. Heat pressed gently, lungs tasting metallic ash, pulse steady. The wasteland whispered faintly, quiet, waiting, scarred, but not defeated. John Constantine. Yeah, this'll do. He inhaled slowly, cigarette smoke curling upward, acrid and bitter, coat brushing jagged debris, boots crunching softly on cracked asphalt. Pulse steady, talisman faintly humming, eyes narrowing at the irradiated horizon. The wasteland had survived, and so had he,